Throughout the alpine regions of Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy, archaeologists have uncovered a macabre musical tradition that persisted from approximately 1500 to 1850. Flutes, whistles, and pipes meticulously crafted from human thigh bones, primarily the femurs of criminals executed for serious offenses. These Totenpfeifen, death whistles, weren't merely gruesome novelties, but sophisticated instruments possessing distinctive tonal qualities. The dense cortical bone of the human femur produces resonant frequencies impossible to replicate with animal bones or wooden instruments, creating what period musicians described as voices from beyond, with eerie harmonics that carry unusually far across mountain valleys. The tradition originated in practical necessity. In the isolated alpine communities where wood was precious and needed for heating, human bones from executed criminals provided readily available material. Courts specifically sentenced murderers to become music after death, with execution protocols requiring careful preservation of long bones for instrument makers. Most disturbing was the customization process. Craftsmen would select bones based on the crimes committed: murderers' bones for hunting whistles, thieves for household signaling, and adulterers for wedding music, creating a grim form of posthumous punishment where the criminal's remains served the community they had wronged. The instruments typically featured elaborately carved designs depicting the executed person's crimes or religious symbols meant to purify the material. Players often knew whose bones they were playing, creating a disturbing intimacy between musician and instrument. Historical accounts describe how hunters carrying these whistles would announce successful kills by playing specific melodies, believing the criminal spirit helped locate prey as ongoing penance. Alpine folklore maintained that these instruments possessed unique powers. During storms, shepherds played them, believing the sound could disperse threatening weather patterns. More sinisterly, village executions concluded with the newly made bone whistle playing a specific three-note melody, confirming death to distant villages across mountain valleys. In the West African kingdom of Dahomey, now southern Benin, a ritual of unmatched brutality defined royal succession for over 3 centuries. When a king died, his heir participated in a ceremony called the strengthening of the blood, consuming the still warm heart of his father's bravest enemy. Captured specifically for this purpose, European observers documented this practice from the early 1700s until Dahomey's fall to French colonization in 1894. Captain John Adams, a British trader who witnessed the ritual in 1810, described how war captains nominated their strongest prisoners specifically for this purpose. The chosen warrior was kept alive in ceremonial confinement until the king's death, sometimes for years, fed a specialized diet believed to strengthen his heart. When a king died, royal embalmers prepared his body while court officials retrieved the designated prisoner. At sunrise, the prisoner faced a ritualized combat against royal guards, not to earn freedom, but to demonstrate courage. After inevitably being subdued, the prisoner was brought before the heir in the palace courtyard. Court physicians administered a paralytic derived from curare plants that immobilized the victim while leaving him conscious. The royal butcher would then open the prisoner's chest while still alive, remove the beating heart, and present it to the heir on a golden plate. The successor would consume the heart raw, in full view of court officials and representatives from all provinces. Foreign observers reported that some heirs required multiple attempts, vomiting before finally keeping the organ down. This horrific ritual reflected Dahomean spiritual beliefs about courage and power transference. The Fan people of Dahomey believed the heart contained Se, life force, and Wu, personal courage, which could be absorbed through consumption. By eating an enemy's heart, the new king symbolically incorporated the strength of enemies into the throne, while demonstrating his willingness to overcome personal revulsion for the kingdom's benefit. King Gezo, 1818 to 1858, perhaps Dahomey's most powerful ruler, reportedly modified the tradition by consuming hearts from multiple enemies upon ascension, one from each neighboring kingdom to symbolize dominance over all surrounding powers. The last documented heart-eating ceremony occurred in 1890 during King Behanzon's coronation, just 4 years before French colonial forces overthrew the kingdom. Deep in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula lie thousands of cenotes, natural sinkholes revealing crystal-clear groundwater beneath limestone bedrock. While modern tourists marvel at their beauty, archaeologists have discovered these serene pools served a darker purpose in Maya civilization. sacred wells dedicated to Chake, the rain deity, where human sacrifices were conducted on a massive scale during drought years. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza has yielded the most disturbing evidence of these practices. Since the early 1900s, archaeological dredging has recovered over 120 human skeletons, primarily children and adolescents aged 4 to 14, alongside thousands of artifacts. Forensic analysis reveals these weren't honorable sacrifices but terrifying deaths. Many skeletons show evidence of being bound or caged before submersion, with leather restraints still preserved in some cases. Most victims were alive when thrown in, their lungs filled with water, proving they drowned rather than being killed beforehand. What makes these discoveries particularly macabre are signs of systematic selection and preparation. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel confirms many victims weren't local, but were brought from distant regions specifically for sacrifice. Skeletal evidence shows some children were systematically starved for weeks before sacrifice, creating what Maya priests called worthy vessels, emaciated bodies believed to be empty enough to temporarily house rain deities. The ritualistic cruelty extended beyond drowning. Some skeletons display blue pigmentation from being painted with sacred Maya blue before sacrifice. This mineral-based pigment remarkably preserved underwater for centuries. Others show evidence of heart extraction performed before drowning, with characteristic cut marks on ribs, indicating chest opening. Historical accounts describe how priests would toss still-beating hearts into the cenote before the victim's body followed. Perhaps most disturbing are remains showing children were often conscious witnesses to other sacrifices before their own turns came. Archaeologists have found evidence of temporary wooden platforms constructed at cenote edges where groups of children were kept for days during extended ceremonial cycles, watching as peers were selected one by one. These drowning pits represent the dark intersection of environmental stress, religious belief, and political power. During severe droughts between 800 to 1000 CE, on Yemen's isolated Socotra Island grows one of Earth's most bizarre and ancient plant species, the dragon blood tree, Dracaena cinnabari, a prehistoric-looking umbrella-shaped tree that, when cut, weeps a viscous crimson sap so similar to human blood that for centuries traders sold it as actual dragon's blood with supposed magical properties. This blood-red resin has been harvested since at least 1st century CE, when Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder documented its use in medicine and funeral rites. When the tree's bark is slashed, beads of bright crimson liquid slowly emerge, oxidizing to deep red upon air exposure. The liquid coagulates into brittle ruby-red crystals remarkably similar in appearance to dried blood, complete with color variations mimicking the oxygenated-deoxygenated transition seen in human blood. The tree's macabre connection to death rituals spans civilizations. Ancient Egyptians used dragon's blood in mummification, mixing it with natron to create a preservative paste packed into body cavities. The resin's natural antimicrobial properties inhibited decomposition, while its blood-like appearance satisfied symbolic requirements for funerary rites. Yemeni desert tribes traditionally employed it in preparing bodies for burial, believing it formed a protective barrier preventing soil from directly touching flesh. Medieval European physicians prescribed dragon's blood as a coagulant for wounds, believing the doctrine of signatures, that a substance resembling blood must affect blood. More disturbingly, it became a primary ingredient in Egyptian mummy medicinal preparations. Concoctions containing actual, ground-up mummified human remains that were prescribed until the 18th century. Socotran locals maintain older, darker traditions. Island shamans harvest the resin during specific lunar phases for death magic rituals, creating effigies of enemies that, when dissolved in water with the resin, supposedly cause targets to hemorrhage internally. More beneficially, traditional Socotran birth practices involve painting the resin on newborns' umbilical stumps, its antimicrobial properties preventing infection. The trees themselves seem almost sentient, living up to 650 years with bizarre appearance combining elements of palm, pine, and mushroom. Their blood weeping has created centuries of mythology, with some ancient texts claiming the trees grew from actual dragon blood spilled in primordial battles. In 1821, when notorious murderer John Horwood faced execution at Bristol Jail, his body's journey was just beginning. Surgeon Richard Smith, who performed the mandatory dissection following hanging, didn't stop at anatomical examination. Instead, he carefully flayed Horwood's skin, tanned it like leather, and used it to bind a book detailing the criminal's trial and execution, creating what anthropologists now call an anthropodermic bibliopegy, or human skin book. This wasn't an isolated case of macabre craftsmanship. During the late 18th and 19th centuries, medical professionals across Europe and America created hundreds of such volumes, primarily using skin from executed criminals, unclaimed bodies from poorhouses, and occasionally psychiatric patients. The practice flourished during the Enlightenment when human anatomy became increasingly secularized, transforming from sacred vessel to scientific specimen. The creation process was methodical and sophisticated. After careful removal, skin underwent tanning with alum and mineral salts before stretching across wooden frames, identical to preparation methods for animal parchment. The resulting material possessed distinctive characteristics, slightly darker than calfskin with visible pores, and sometimes subtle hair follicle patterns. Most disturbing were books where the skin's origin could be identified: a nipple, visible on a corner binding, a tattoo incorporated into decorative elements, or finger joints used as spine hinges. Harvard's Houghton Library confirmed its collection includes volumes bound in human skin, including one bearing the inscription, "The binding of this book is all that remains of my dear friend." Edinburgh University possesses a pocketbook made from the skin of notorious grave robber William Burke. The Mutter Museum holds several examples, including a 17th-century Belgian text discussing female health, ironically bound in female skin. In France, revolutionary physician Jean-Joseph Sue crafted an entire collection of human skin-bound anatomy texts, each book's covering taken from the body part described within: chest skin binding thoracic anatomy, facial skin covering facial surgery texts. These books served dual purposes: functional containers of knowledge and philosophical statements about mortality and justice. Though modern DNA testing has revealed some purported examples to be sheep or goat skin, approximately 18 confirmed human-bound books exist in public collections worldwide, with private collections likely containing dozens more. During the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, an alarming phenomenon plagued graveyards across Britain and America, coffins inexplicably exploding beneath the earth, sometimes with enough force to disturb the soil above. Gravediggers reported hearing muffled booms while working, only to discover fractured casket lids and disturbed remains when digging nearby plots. These macabre detonations stemmed directly from Victorian burial innovations. In response to fears of being buried alive, manufacturers created safety coffins with hermetically sealed metal or lead linings, air tubes, and viewing windows. While intended as humane improvements, these airtight environments inadvertently created perfect conditions for anaerobic decomposition, transforming caskets into pressurized vessels filled with volatile gases. As bodies decomposed in these sealed environments, bacteria produce methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen compounds at alarming rates. Without ventilation, pressure built dramatically. The typical human body produces approximately 30 liters of gas during decomposition, contained within an airtight space. This creates pressure exceeding 20 psi, more than enough to rupture wooden coffin joints or split metal seams. The explosions particularly terrified Victorian society given their cultural obsession with the good death and bodily integrity. Cemetery workers documented cases where explosive force ejected decomposed tissue through fractured caskets into surrounding soil or neighboring graves, a grotesque violation of sacred space. Some explosions reportedly displaced grave markers or damaged cemetery structures. Religious authorities faced theological dilemmas about whether exploded remains could properly resurrect on Judgment Day, while public health officials worried about groundwater contamination from forcefully dispersed decomposition decomposition fluids. The phenomenon became so common that specialized coffin torpedoes were patented, spring-loaded devices that would puncture casket bottoms after burial, releasing pressure gradually rather than catastrophically. By the late 19th century, morticians began addressing the issue by embalming, removing blood and replacing it with formaldehyde-based preservatives, and using burping caskets with one-way valves that allowed gases to escape while preventing soil intrusion. In 1980, Haitian villagers spotted Clervius Narcisse walking through a marketplace, remarkable considering his documented death and burial 18 years earlier. Medical records confirmed his 1962 death certificate. Physicians had verified his vital signs, declared him dead, and his family had buried him. Yet here he stood, explaining that a Bokor, voodoo sorcerer, had captured his soul, transforming him into a zombie, a fate he claimed was worse than true death. Narcisse's case drew Harvard ethnobotanist Wade Davis to Haiti, where his investigation revealed the disturbing scientific reality behind this folkloric phenomenon. Rather than supernatural resurrection, zombification employed sophisticated neurotoxins, primarily tetrodotoxin extracted from pufferfish, combined with selected plant compounds including datura. When administered, this powder creates a nightmarish living death. Victims experience respiratory depression and dramatically reduced metabolism while maintaining minimal brain function. Heart rate becomes nearly undetectable, body temperature drops, and paralysis sets in, perfectly mimicking death while leaving consciousness partially intact. Victims report horrifying awareness during their funeral preparations, unable to communicate while family members grieve beside them. After burial, accomplices exhume the victim before oxygen. Deprivation causes permanent damage. The individual awakens with significant brain trauma from oxygen deprivation and datura's dissociative effects, creating docile confusion. Families rarely recognize these profoundly altered individuals, who typically exhibit shuffling gaits, vacant expressions, and impaired speech, the classic zombie characteristics stemming from neurological damage rather than mystical transformation. Most disturbing are victims' accounts of their experiences. They describe hearing their coffin lids being sealed, feeling insects crawling across their immobilized bodies during burial, and understanding everything happening while unable to move or communicate. These zombies mindless, but rather trapped in damaged bodies with memories of their previous lives, a tortured existence where they witness their own transformation from person to property. Though rooted in Haiti's complex history of slavery and colonial oppression, similar practices have been documented in isolated communities throughout the Caribbean, West Africa, and parts of South America. While modern medicine can now identify zombification, the psychological trauma of being declared dead while consciously aware remains perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this practice. Dengue fever's terrifying nickname, breakbone fever, originated in the Caribbean during the 1780s when Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush documented a West Indies outbreak, recording patients who described feeling as though their bones were breaking at the joints. With pain so intense, many wished for death as relief. This horrific sensation results from the virus's unique attack on the body's musculoskeletal system. Unlike most viral infections that primarily target specific organs, dengue infiltrates bone marrow, creating microscopic hemorrhages within bone tissue itself. Simultaneously, the virus triggers a massive inflammatory cytokine storm, causing immune cells to attack joint capsules, muscle attachments, and even the periosteum, the sensitive membrane covering all bones. This combined assault creates the signature sensation of bones shattering from within. Historical accounts from 19th century colonial physicians describe patients exhibiting disturbing physical contortions as they attempted to escape the pain. Some sufferers would force limbs into bizarre positions that seemingly defied anatomy, believing alternative postures might provide momentary relief. Others begged for limb amputation, convinced their bones had splintered beyond repair despite no external injury. The horror extends beyond pain. As dengue progresses, victims experience retroorbital agony, pain behind the eyes so severe that pressure appears to build until eyeballs might rupture, splitting headaches described as an axe repeatedly striking the skull, and skin so hypersensitive that even bedsheets touching the body causes screams of agony. In severe cases, dengue hemorrhagic fever develops, where vomiting blood and bleeding from bodily orifices occurs as capillaries become permeable. During this phase, patients report the sensation of bones grinding against each other like broken glass with each movement, while internally, their blood chemistry destabilizes as platelets plummet. Modern treatment can manage symptoms, but the fundamental experience remains largely unchanged from historical accounts. With climate change expanding the range of Aedes mosquitoes that transmit the disease, this centuries-old torture that feels like systematic skeletal destruction continues advancing into new regions. Beneath Sicily's Capuchin Monastery lies one of the world's most unsettling necropolises, corridors lined with nearly 8,000 mummified bodies, many bearing eerie, frozen smiles despite centuries in death's embrace. The Capuchin catacombs of Palermo represent not only a remarkable preservation technique, but a uniquely Sicilian approach to the boundary between life and death. The catacombs began in 1599 when monks discovered the local soil and atmospheric conditions naturally preserved a deceased brother. Soon, wealthy Palermitans requested similar preservation, willing to pay handsomely for this alternative to anonymous burial. The monks perfected a unique process. Bodies spent approximately 1 year drying on ceramic racks that drained fluids, followed by washing in vinegar and stuffing with straw to maintain form. Some received arterial injections of arsenic solutions that remarkably preserved facial features. What distinguishes these mummies from others worldwide is their presentation. Rather than concealed in coffins, they stand in niches, hang from walls, or recline in open caskets, dressed in their finest clothes, updated by relatives for decades after death. Men wear formal suits, women display jewelry, and priests don their vestments, creating the unsettling impression of a social gathering frozen in time. Most disturbing are their expressions, particularly the frequency of apparent smiles. This phenomenon results from the unique drying process, which contracts facial muscles around the mouth in ways that pull lips into grimacing grins. Simultaneously, skin shrinkage often reveals teeth, creating what visitors describe as welcoming smiles or mocking grins, depending on angle and lighting. The practice continued until the 1920s, culminating with 2-year-old Rosalia Lombardo, whose remarkably preserved body, appearing merely asleep, represents the pinnacle of the embalmer's art. Though new internments were prohibited in 1881, families continued maintaining their ancestors for decades, speaking to them, changing their clothing on special occasions, and taking family portraits, including their preserved relatives. In Naples' ornate cathedral lies a small glass vial containing a dark, solid substance, the alleged blood of Saint Januarius, a bishop martyred in 305 CE during Emperor Diocletian's Christian persecutions. 3 times yearly, this centuries-old relic becomes the focus of one of Catholicism's most enduring and scientifically perplexing mysteries. During specific ceremonies, September 19th, December 16th, and the Saturday before the first Sunday of May, the Archbishop removes the sealed vial from its secure vault and rotates it before gathered crowds. Within minutes, sometimes instantly, sometimes after hours, the solid brownish mass liquefies, becoming vibrant red liquid that sloshes within the container. This transformation occurs despite the relic remaining sealed in the same hermetically closed glass ampules since at least 1389, with no evidence of tampering. The scientific enigma deepens upon examination of historical records. The miracle of liquefaction has been documented continuously since 1389, occurring thousands of times over centuries, often observed by scientific and medical professionals. Spectroscopic analysis through the glass confirms the presence of hemoglobin, though the Church has never permitted direct sampling. For Neapolitans, the miracle's occurrence carries prophetic significance. Rapid liquefaction portends good fortune for the city, while failure or delayed liquefaction has historically preceded disasters. When the blood failed to liquefy in 1527, Plague devastated Naples. Similar failures preceded earthquakes in 1980 and economic hardships throughout history. Scientists have proposed various explanations: thixotropic substances that liquefy when agitated, heat-sensitive mixtures, or medieval chemical knowledge creating sophisticated illusions. Yet experiments attempting to replicate the phenomenon have failed to match the relic's behavior, particularly its variable liquefaction times and temperature independence. During a 2015 visit by Pope Francis, the blood partially liquefied, an unprecedented occurrence outside scheduled dates, intensifying both religious fervor and scientific curiosity. For believers, this miraculous blood represents divine presence in the material world. For scientists, during the American Civil War, military surgeons performed approximately 60,000 amputations, accounting for 3/4 of all battlefield operations. Without antibiotics and with limited anesthesia, often just whiskey, morphine, or chloroform, that frequently ran out mid-procedure, soldiers endured excruciating pain as surgeons removed shattered limbs using handsaws, knives, and bone forceps. Yet a more profound torture awaited survivors. Within days, many reported sensations in their missing limbs: burning pain, unbearable itching, fingers seemingly curled into painful positions impossible to relieve. Some described feeling their amputated hands clawing through battlefield dirt or feet walking when they clearly lay immobile in field hospitals. Union Army surgeon Silas Weir Mitchell first documented this phenomenon in 1871, naming it phantom limb syndrome. Through interviews with thousands of veterans, Mitchell discovered nearly 98% experienced some sensation in missing extremities, with many reporting they could move phantom fingers or feel weather changes in absent limbs. The neurological explanation remained elusive until the late 20th century. We now understand that when a limb is traumatically removed, the brain's neural map doesn't immediately update. The somatosensory cortex continues generating signals as if the limb remains, while interrupted nerve pathways at the amputation site create chaotic feedback patterns interpreted as pain or sensation. Civil War veterans' accounts reveal the psychological torment this caused. Many became addicted to opiates trying to relieve phantom pain. Others developed elaborate rituals, massaging stumps, applying tourniquets, or even exercising missing limbs to find relief. Some reported phantom limbs gradually telescoping over years, seeming to shrink until only ghostly hands or feet remained attached directly to stumps. Perhaps most poignant were cases where soldiers feeling pain in phantom hands found their amputated rings, had comrades placed them on stumps at the anatomically correct position, and reported immediate relief, demonstrating the powerful connection between physical sensation and psychological expectation. In India's sacred Ganges River, an ecological horror story unfolds daily as specialized fish have evolved to feast primarily on human remains. The river, revered as the goddess Ganga by over 1 billion Hindus, receives thousands of partially cremated corpses yearly, victims of poverty, as many families cannot afford sufficient wood for complete cremation. The most notorious of these aquatic scavengers is the goonch catfish, Bagarius urelli, which can grow to over 6 feet long and weigh 150 pounds. Normally a predator of smaller fish, these massive catfish have adapted to consume human flesh sloughing from corpses. Their powerful jaws and rows of needle-like teeth easily tear through soft tissue, while their digestive systems have adapted to process human remains with remarkable efficiency. The river's ecosystem has become macabrely specialized, with different species targeting specific parts of decomposing bodies. While goonch catfish consume larger portions, smaller fish like tilapia and carp pick at extremities. Turtles often scavenge eyes and other soft tissues, while river crabs dismember fingers and toes with surgical precision. This grim symbiosis intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic when cremation facilities were overwhelmed. Hundreds of bodies were simply abandoned in the river, creating what locals called fish-feeding frenzies, visible from riverbanks. Fishermen reported catching catfish with recognizably human remains in their stomachs, including jewelry, dental work, and bone fragments. Most disturbing are accounts from Varanasi, where fish have been observed gathering beneath funeral pyres built on ghats, riverbank steps, anticipating the inevitable arrival of charred remains. Some religious traditions intentionally place bodies directly into the river, believing the water purifies the soul, and that consumption by fish speeds the cycle of reincarnation. Though shocking to outsiders, this ecological cycle represents the complex intersection of spiritual practice, poverty, and environmental adaptation. The fish fulfill a necessary role in preventing disease outbreaks,